Hello, and welcome to Reflections on Film. In this video, I'll be talking about the 2014 film, Birdman, or The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance, directed by Alejandro Iñárritu. Throughout this series, I'll be providing a frame-by-frame analysis of the opening credits sequence of the film, and as I move forward, I'll be drawing evidence from that analysis to support one possible interpretation of the film's meaning. I'll be making the case that the opening credits tell a complete story, the end of which leads directly into the beginning of the main film. The credits tell the story of our main character, Regan Thompson, as he desperately tries to maintain the celebrity status which has come to define his life. His fall from fame forces him to make a choice, either accept the end of his career as a celebrity or live in denial. We see the result of this decision in the main film, which tells the story of Regan's attempt to earn redemption as an actor and an artist by putting on an ambitious Broadway play. Not only do the credits tell us this backstory, but they also foreshadow almost all of the events which we see played out in the film. Both stories show our character beginning a new phase in his life, which forces him to confront his own self-ignorance. We then see his inability to accept this ignorance, instead choosing to remain in denial. And ultimately, we see the result of this denial as our character descends deeper into ignorance and eventually, as we see in the film, all-out delusion. Now, in doing this, the director creates a portrayal of not just one series of events, but of a cyclical pattern of behavior from which our main character struggles to escape. And it is this cyclical pattern of ignorance which will form the basis for my final interpretation of the film, in which I'll argue it to be a metaphor for the path to personal enlightenment and ultimately, by escaping that cycle, transcendence of the human condition. Now, right away when I began watching the film for this analysis, I noticed something that I had missed or forgotten about during previous viewings. The film doesn't begin with any images or text on screen, but with a very subtly placed piece of audio. The sound we hear is of someone speaking, followed by the sounds of a person adjusting a drum kit as the credits for the production and distribution companies appear on screen. I'll go ahead and play a brief clip of these opening moments so you can hear for yourself. I'll play it through twice, once with the normal audio and once with the volume increased.
Empecé con eso, ¿se oía? ¿Se alcanzaba a oír? Empecé con eso, ¿se oía? ¿Se alcanzaba a oír?
I was excited when I heard this because this is the very first piece of information in the film, and we've already been given a sort of clue as to what the director is trying to tell us. The line was deliberately placed at the opening, so naturally I wanted to know what that voice was saying, and more importantly, why the director chose to begin his film with it. First I checked the film's subtitle track, but it didn't give an exact quote. Just a general description of drums clanking, a musician speaking in Spanish, and a syncopated jazz beat. And now that I knew the voice was speaking Spanish, I tried again to figure out what it was saying, but still couldn't really make it out. So I turned to the internet and looked for transcripts of the film. I couldn't find anything with an exact quotation, but I was able to find a handful of interviews in which the drummer who recorded the tracks for the film, his name is Antonio Sanchez, talked about the film's sound design. He said that the drum kits he used for the film were intentionally taken out of tune, making them sound grungy and washed out. Sanchez said that the sound we hear at the beginning of the film is of his voice as he asks the director a question during one of their recording sessions. With this knowledge in mind, I returned to the film, and after many attempts to decipher what was being said, I came up with the following, which I think is pretty close. Empece con esos, yo quería solo ir. And this roughly translates to English as, I start with those, it's the only way to go. I'll play the audio again for you with the volume increased and highlight the text in Spanish so you can compare for yourself.
Empecé con eso, ¿se oía? ¿Se alcanzaba a oír?
I think what we're hearing in these opening moments are meant to be a representation of Riggan's thoughts. We're getting a look inside his mind as he makes a decision and deals with the consequences. The question we hear spoken represents that decision, and it has two key elements. The speaker wants to begin some new process and ultimately decides that he must do this because he doesn't really have any other choice. The drumming that follows can be thought of as a representation of the result of that decision. We hear the drums being taken out of tune while the musician plays a seemingly chaotic and sort of off-putting rhythm. I took this to be a representation of Riggan's life and psychological state spiraling out of control as he begins to explore this new phase in his life. Just like the sounds of the drums, he feels washed out and obsolete. However, the use of improvised jazz to represent this is interesting to me. You can think of syncopation as a sort of subversion of our expectations in music through stressing beats in a measure which would usually be left unstressed, or by using atypical time signatures in a song. Improvised syncopation, as we hear in the film, is a style of music that allows an artist to explore these atypical rhythms with total freedom. A process that allows a musician to explore and discover new ways of making music. Keeping this in mind, I think we can look at the strange drumming patterns and atypical rhythms in the film as a representation of Riggan's emotions as he begins a process of self-exploration, as he begins to challenge the perceptions he holds of himself. It sounds chaotic because it's unfamiliar and confusing to him. Now, all interpretations of its meaning aside, I think this is just a really cool way for a filmmaker to begin a film. With only 2 pieces of audio, the director manages to encapsulate a really complex idea which we see continually explored throughout the film, the universal human experience of self-exploration in the face of ignorance. Now, before I wrap up part 1 of this series, I'd like to talk about one more detail that is cleverly hidden in this opening credit sequence, the meaning of which will help to bridge the gap between this introduction and the rest of the series. Throughout the credits, every letter that we see on screen appears in the uppercase, except for the letter I. Every instance of the letter I that we see on screen is in the lowercase. Even in the final title shot, the I's in Birdman, virtue, and ignorance are all lowercase. However, they are also slightly larger than every other letter on screen, the dots which make them lowercase extending beyond the other letters. I interpreted this to be a representation of the self. The letter I is used in English as a pronoun taking the place of the self in speech. The fact that they are all lowercase indicates that we're seeing a representation of an immature self, one that isn't fully formed as would be represented with an uppercase I. In the film, we see that Riggan is in fact this type of immature self as we follow him on a journey to try and break free of denial and achieve a better understanding of himself. And once again, I think this is a pretty cool detail included by the director. With just a single letter, he manages to encapsulate some very complex ideas involving self-exploration and the desire to seek maturation and self-awareness. Now, that is where I'll bring this first video to a close. After looking at just a few seconds of footage, I feel like the director has given us about as much information to consider as he possibly can in that amount of time. In the next video in this series, I'll be talking more in-depth about what these elements might represent and how they're mirrored in the main film. And just to warn you, that video and all future videos in this series will be very spoiler heavy. All 5 parts of this series are complete and available to watch, so if you're not interested in a frame-by-frame breakdown of the credit sequence, please feel free to skip ahead to the final installment of this series, where I discuss some of the more complex ideas presented in the film and explain my final interpretation of its meaning. Thank you for joining me here at Reflections on Film. If you enjoyed this video or have any ideas about the content I presented, please feel free to comment below. And thanks again for watching.